Elsie John, the hermaphrodite, was my introduction to narcotics. He was working the West End Madison Street in a freak show, half man, half woman. He was a strange creature, as you can well imagine. He stood 6'5" with hennied hair, a fire engine red, and he had a gigantic deep blue eyes, the most expressive eyes I've ever seen. He liked to be called Elsie, and later when I introduced him, it was always as Elsie. Elsie occupied a room in the old Vaudeville Hotel on North State Street. That whole area must have changed by now, but when the circus came to town in those days, people like Elsie would work the freak shows, stayed there. She would sit Turk style in the center of a huge brass bed, and at the foot of it sat a big steamer trunk which contained all her possessions. She had 5 miniature Pekingese dogs who worshipped her. She'd get down and fuss and comb and pet them. They yipped and yapped and leaped all over her. A long mirror occupied one wall and hung from the ceiling almost to the floor. There was a dresser that also had a mirror on it, and that was catty-cornered. No matter what direction you looked, you could see your reflection in a mirror. Else it wasn't literally a hermaphrodite. I've inquired into the matter out of curiosity and found that there has never been any evidence of any true hermaphroditism in the human animal. There are many examples of it in the lower form, supposedly, but not as far as human beings are concerned. She had used the stuff they inject corpses with, paraffin, and it would cause a swelling of the breast on one side. Her body wasn't too hairy, but what hair there was, she shaved very closely. That side was powdered and creamed, and her nails were done into long claws and painted red. On the other side of her body, what hair she had was darkened with mascara, and she had learned to flex her muscles. That part was covered by a sort of leopard skin, while on the other side she wore a spangled skirt and high-heeled shoe. I tell you, she was something to see. They had these little pamphlets, and this was their gimmick. She'd step out on the platform with a barker who had been working with her for a long time. He knew just how to get those suckers in, and they stood there with their jaws hanging. They figured they were going to see a half man, half woman. I knew her for a long time before I knew that she actually wasn't. She'd done some sort of operation just above the penis, which in itself was extremely small for anyone as large as this poor creature was. She was huge, and she wore her hair long, severely brushed back on one side with a sideburn. The rest was allowed to hang Veronica Lake style. She had all this red hair hanging down, and she came out on stage with a long flowing cape wrapped around her. Elsie was so mammoth, most people were terrified of her. It cost $0.25 to get in the gate to see the real thing when she stripped down. Now, what she did inside, I have no idea. When I stop by to see her, I act as a shell. I'd buy one of the first pamphlets and start the ball rolling. If Johnny was with me, he'd buy one too. The first thing you know, they'd collect 10, maybe 15 bucks. These suckers would go inside, stay there for about 5 or 10 minutes. Of course, everyone must understand that they're not allowed to expose themselves completely. But if you'll all move a little closer, you'll see. And she'd quickly pull a little gadget that she had worn aside, and they really thought they were seeing something. Elsie John was born in Alsace-Lorraine and had a melodious voice and an elegant accent, but one of the filthiest tongues I've ever heard. At that time, motherfucker was a word you didn't hear much. Anybody who said motherfucker in those days, Jesus got up and fired her else. Every other word out of her mouth was motherfucker this, motherfucker that, and just because your mother sucks dick, you don't need to think that everybody else does. She really had a tongue. She would get on those old-fashioned trolley cars, stoned out of her mind. She could cook up a spoonful of heroin that would knock you and me out cold. Of course, I was still inexperienced, but I watched as she got herself off and her eyes would glisten like a pair of headlights. Then she'd get on the back end of one of those trolley cars and drop fare in the token box. In the wintertime, she wore a funny old pack coat so that it fell a little bit over her shoulders. People always stepped back from her. She would give me a piddling amount of H. They used to sell it in decks in those days instead of glassine bags. They'd fold a piece of paper into a little package. They called it a deck, selling for about 60 cents. She was the first person who ever turned me on to the stuff. Johnny became far more intimate with Elsie on a business level than I did. It was all a lark to me in those days. I was still just having fun. I used to love to turn on and smoke pot, just walk down the street and look at the people. This is still my kick, but Johnny had come to value the buck. Money don't mean much to me and never has. He was beginning to think in terms of making money, and so he was getting a lot closer to those people than I was. Eventually, I didn't know what was going on or who some of these people were. Elsie would get a lot of grass and people would begin to call. She sold joints ready-made. You could get 7 joints for a quarter, 7 joints of really boss pot. Manicured, no twigs, no seeds, 1 or 2 tokes on that, and boom. Sometimes I would make a delivery of grass to some friends, but I'd never have anything to do with heroin. Elsie would never ask me to deliver heroin. In fact, she was reluctant to sell it to me. She'd rather sit down and give me a fix than sell it to me. I guess being the youngest and smallest and most gullible in the crowd, they figured I wasn't to be trusted. In a business sense, they were probably right. In those days, if somebody had threatened to kick me in the balls, I'd say, well, what is it you want to know? I don't think I was a potential rat. I was a bad risk. Being a bad risk was a serious consideration to a dealer. The cops, if they picked you up, invariably would ask you where you scored. They had some very effective ways of extracting this information. Now, as a pusher, Elsie wasn't much of a success because everybody soon got wise. She wouldn't let you go sick. As a result, much more was going out than coming in. Eventually, one of the cats she befriended got caught shooting up, and when asked where he scored, he turned in Elsie. I will never forget the shock and terror of that moment. The door was thrust open, and a big red-faced cop shouted, "Police." He was followed by 2 more cops, one who sort of grasped open, seeing Elsie, and then turned to one of the others, saying, "Get a load of this degenerate bastard. We sure hit the jackpot this time. This is a queer son of a bitch if I ever saw one. What the hell are these?" As he came aware of the dogs who had gathered around Elsie and were barking and yipping. "Goddamn lap dogs. What do they lap on you?" he said as he sort of thrust himself toward Elsie. Elsie had thrown herself up to full height and suddenly began saying, "I'm a hermaphrodite and I've got papers to prove it." She tried to shove a couple of pamphlets which she used in her sideshow gimmick towards the cop. Meanwhile, one of the others had already found our works in the stash of junk, about ½ an ounce, and was busy tearing Elsie's trunk apart, pulling out the drawers, dumping their contents in the center of the bed. It was when one of the cops stepped on the dog that Elsie began crying. They took us all down to the city jail on South State Street, and since Johnny and I were minors, they let us go the next morning. The last time I saw Elsie was in the bullpen, sort of cowering in the corner, surrounded by a group of young West Side hoods who had been picked up the same night we were, who were exposing themselves to her and yelling all sorts of obscenities. Thank you.